So you know when you're at a gas station or a dollar store and you wander by the section dedicated to DVDs and you see something which is clearly trying to be another popular film? Let's say it's a classic Brancato DVD that's trying its hardest to look like Kung Fu Panda. Now you're a dedicated DreamWorks fan, it does not take a lot of research for you to look into this situation and figure out if this is a real DVD or not. Even if the title's not a dead giveaway, you can look at the cast, you can look at the crew, you can look at what company made it, you can study this whole thing for any small details that might be different from the original release. But what if these tactics stopped working? What if Video Brancato convinced Jack Black himself to appear in their films despite them not being licensed? Or what if Video Brancato just changed their company name to be one letter away from DreamWorks? The answer, ladies and gentlemen, is currently in my hands. This is a VHS tape from the 1990s. At the top are 3 cast members cited: Colin Baker, Nicola Bryant, and Sophie Aldred. These were all actors who appeared in the television show Doctor Who in the late 80s. Across the center is a bright strip which reads, "A double bill from the world of BBC TV's Doctor Who." Studying the back, we find a quote from Doctor Who magazine, and when we look at the copyright, we see it's made by BBV, which surely must stand for British Broadcasting Video, which would logically be a subsidiary of the British Broadcasting Corporation. Any rational person would pick up this tape, look at all the signs all the way across it, and presume that it must be legitimate. But don't be fooled. This is not real Doctor Who. This is a knockoff, in the same vein as anything made by Brancato or Asylum Films. It's just so seamless an imitation that even I would be tricked into buying it if I didn't know better. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the story of the wilderness years, the vacuous gap from 1989 to 2005, when Doctor Who just wasn't feeling itself.
Deedle-a-dum, 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 dum-dum, da-da, deedle-a-dum, 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 dum-dum, da-da, deedle-a-dum, 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 dum-dum, da-da, deedle-a-dum, deedle-a-dum, dum-dum, da-da, deedle-a-dum, 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 dum-dum, da-da, deedle-a-dum, deedle-a-dum, da-da-da-da-da. That's the intro.
A brief crash course on the history of the show for those who don't know much about it. Doctor Who was created in 1963 with the intention of combining what was, at that point, the 2 strong suits of British programming: period pieces and campy sci-fi dramas. The early show starts off with a mysterious elderly figure who becomes known as the Doctor, mainly because he's too stubborn to actually tell anyone what his real name is. He travels with his granddaughter Susan and 2 of her teachers in his time spaceship, which he seemingly cannot accurately control. In each episode, the cast lands somewhere and gets separated from the TARDIS, and they have to make it back to safety through various perils. Despite it being a core element, Doctor Who was not originally about time travel in the same way that, say, Back to the Future is. While the ship was the base for the show's premise, in a way it was only the vessel which the characters used to get from story to story. The actual adventures would just depend on where they ended up, be it a radioactive alien planet or Aztec-occupied Mexico. This format proved to be both instantly electric and worthy of reinvention. Companions to the Doctor soon began to exit and were replaced thereafter, and 3 years in, the concept of the Doctor being rejuvenated was introduced. Thus, even the lead actor could be replaced without the show needing to stop. From then, the story of Doctor Who is quite easy to predict. Every few years, the Doctor changes his face, his companions come and go as they please, and whenever an anniversary happens, some of the actors return to celebrate the many different versions of the program. However, by the time the show had reached its 20th year in 1983, small problems in its foundation had spread to be massive cracks. To put it bluntly, the BBC was a company that was used to making hospital soap operas and adaptations of Shakespeare plays. That same group of industry professionals was being expected to produce what was supposed to be groundbreaking science fiction with the same limited resources. Sometimes that didn't go so well. Here's the gist of the situation. By the 1980s, many powerful people at the BBC were deeply embarrassed by Doctor Who. They were embarrassed because it looked bad. It looked bad because the show wasn't being given enough money. And it wasn't being given enough money because the BBC was embarrassed by it. Things were not helped when, in 1984, Colin Baker became the 6th Doctor. Producer John Nathan Turner created this version of the character to be purposefully unpopular. He was given a hilariously gaudy costume, was written to be very snide and often unheroic. and was overall intended to make the audience question if they really liked him as the Doctor. He's my favorite! Unsurprisingly, ratings started to tank after this, which is a shame because the final 5 years of Doctor Who hold some of the best stories that the show ever created, as well as some of the most intriguing characters and story arcs. But it never really recovered to the extent that it needed to, and in 1989 it was officially decided amongst the inner workings of the company that the show would not be renewed for 1990. Then it wasn't renewed for 1991, and then 1992. And basically that for 16 years. You probably wouldn't be surprised to find out that a television show which ran for 26 years, 13 days, 2 hours and 45 minutes managed to develop quite a fan following. This was so true that the official BBC-ran publication Doctor Who magazine, which was dedicated to covering the production of the show, continued to be in publication for almost every month that the show was off the air. This fanbase was gigantic, but they were left mostly frustrated as the BBC chose to keep their favorite show in a centrifugal limbo. They wouldn't say that it was cancelled for good, but they wouldn't really say that it was going to come back. Rumors about potential reboots and continuations with American networks circulated for years, but to most people, the situation just seemed entirely hopeless. Enter Bill Baggs. Baggs was the producer of an underground Doctor Who fan series who had also built up a name as an organizer of conventions. He had dreams of branching out and becoming a legitimate director, but despite his best efforts, by 1990 he had only been able to obtain a low-level editing job at the BBC. However, as a member of the BBC Film Club, he had managed to obtain funding for his very first project. While meant as a training exercise, Baggs would truly create something still worthy of being discussed so many years later. The tape was to be called Summoned by Shadows, and it would be part of a series called simply The Stranger. The Stranger is, essentially, Doctor Who in everything but name. When I say that, I don't mean that it was a project so influenced by Doctor Who that it was unoriginal. I mean that it was written, produced, cast, and marketed with the intention of being an episode of Doctor Who, but created without permission and barely skirting around the nature of copyright.
You're looking for me. You need my help. No. Whatever you heard about me, it's not true, not anymore.
The main stars of the first 3 Stranger tapes are Colin Baker and Nicola Bryant, both actors who had appeared in The Real Deal as Doctor and Companion some years earlier. While billed as The Stranger and Miss Brown, the gimmick of these films is just that their characters never get around to telling anyone what their names are, meaning that the audience can and should interpret that the characters are the same ones they had played on TV.
I've got a friend out there. He might be able to help. Really? Is he a doctor? Well...
I cannot overstate that these 3 tapes are so unapologetically just Doctor Who that if you go into them without a very thorough understanding of the show, you will have no idea what's going on. The main characters are never really introduced. They just show up, have minimal dialogue, and they're presented as if we're supposed to already understand who they are and why they're here, when in reality the film isn't throwing out any big clues. Each movie is set on an entirely different planet, and the narrative suggests that the main characters travel in space and time, but we never see how they do this. There's this one really inexplicable moment near the end of the second tape, where the main characters are on a planet which is literally exploding, and then we clearly see the planet explode, and it immediately cuts to them somewhere else, completely safe, with no explanation of how they got away.
There's nothing you can do! No! You mean she was some kind of antibody?
The clear implication is that there's just like a police box sitting just out of frame, and anytime the characters need to get away, they just waddle out of shot. And the reason they've had to do this is because they're literally trying to write Doctor Who without showing anything that they could get sued over. They're essentially purposefully delivering an incomplete product just for the sake of maintaining a weak continuity to the show that this is inspired by. Almost entirely, so some nerd at home can decide that this fits into their headcanon.
Have you never been in love?
No, not really, no. Never really had time for it. I'm a wanderer, explorer. Far too much to see and experience to waste time being...
In love?
Quite.
Yet I sense a loneliness.
Oh, nonsense.
You've lost so many.
People come and go.
Despite these issues, I was surprised in watching these to discover that they were of higher quality than I expected them to be. The first one's just okay, it's very bare bones, and the story's sort of tedious, and it reminds me too much of bad episodes of the show. But the second one is so good that if it were real Doctor Who, it would probably be Colin's best episode. On that note, it has a storyline which is one of those ones where it's intriguing in the moment, but when you describe it out loud after the fact, it sounds sort of comedic. So we're going to do that now. So basically, a planet turns into a human woman and falls madly in love with Colin Baker. But then she gets mad and she gets shot and she explodes, and Colin Baker is sad because he loved Woman Planet, I think. There's this really weird scene in the movie where Sophie Aldred and Colin are naked for a hot minute, and I don't know why, because nothing in the scene or in the scene surrounding would suggest that he was naked, and in fact it sort of contradicts the whole point of the storyline. Now don't get me wrong, Colin Baker is a renowned sex symbol worldwide. I mean, if I could, I would. But it's just weird to me that Bill Baggs' obsession with putting random partial nudity in his films always seemed to result in Colin showing more skin than anyone else. But out of the whole series, I think the best one is probably the third tape. At this point, Bill Baggs was joined in these adventures by his friend of many years known as Nick Briggs. Briggs was intent in making the series much more unique and set apart from its previous work, which is something you can certainly say he succeeded in. In Memory Alone, written by and starring Briggs, sees Bryant and Baker's characters finding themselves in a train station with no memories of who they are. I'm very much a man in love with the storytelling technique of having the main characters suddenly come into existence just as the story starts, leading them to process everything around them in the same pace that we do. The story also has a lot of dreamlike elements which simply can't be beat in terms of mystery storytelling, and it's just so atmospheric and suspenseful, I was very much blown away by it. However, the plot point of the two main characters not being able to remember their own identities was introduced because it was becoming hard to write them as their Doctor Who counterparts without acknowledging BBC-owned details. It just doesn't make sense for these characters to never mention any details about their lives, including what their names are, for such a long period of time. Wiping their memories made this not an issue anymore, and it additionally just happened to make the special a lot more interesting. Suddenly and mysteriously, Nicola Bryant never worked with Bill Baggs ever again. By this point, it should be said that Bill Baggs had officially decided to name his video production group Bill and Ben Video, Ben being the nickname of his then wife, Helen. This would, of course, be initialized as BBV. There are only really two potential reasons why he chose this name. Either he thought it would be funny, or he seriously thought that in naming his company BBV, he could trick people into thinking that his Doctor Who fan films were official. Honestly, giving Baggs as a looted character in coming years, I think either possibility is equally likely. Nick Briggs apparently hated the idea of producing The Stranger to be Doctor Who in everything but name, feeling that it stifled the creativity on the projects and that it could potentially lead to BBC legal action. At the same time, Bill Baggs was becoming uninterested in continuing to produce Doctor Who and wanted to expand his prospects elsewhere. With this, the Stranger tapes would go on, but with some serious twists along the way. The remaining Stranger tapes are just weird to me. I don't know. I feel like other people get something out of them, but to me they're at best surreal and at worst really embarrassing. It's one of those sets of films where the people making it have big ideas, but they don't have the budget to make anything. So the entire movie is people running around these affordable places in Nottingham describing sci-fi concepts that they didn't have the money to shoot.
Lost Preceptor Cell leader located at this transverse point seems to have arrived without a portal.
Did the Protectorate send you to sabotage this mission, to infiltrate this cell? They'd like that.
The cell have him now. I couldn't intervene without risking detection.
Look, that is Raven. This is the random power break we detected. The random power break reaches its correct transverse point at 10 o'clock tonight. That's when we kill him. Because that's when it's safe to get back into the dimensional web.
If you want a sci-fi movie where characters are standing around non-sci-fi locations and describing a sci-fi movie that the creators didn't have the money to make, oh boy, does Bill Baggs got you covered. I'm not going to pretend I understand this film. All you really need to know is that the big twist of the movie is that the Stranger, who up to this point was implied to just be space dandy Doctor Who, is actually an interdimensional terrorist named Solomon who has killed many people in the past and simply has forgotten his memories. Yeah, it sounds like a bit of a cool twist, but trust me when I say it, it really doesn't work. It was a pretty open secret on the set of these last few projects that Bill Baggs was only doing them to potentially get jobs directing real shows for the BBC. One of these films, for instance, mainly focuses on being a police drama because Baggs was trying to get a job directing a police drama show. The issue is that he sold these tapes to Doctor Who fans, had them reviewed and advertised in Doctor Who magazine, and overall tried to package them to be disguised as Doctor Who. So he goes out of his way to incorporate elements of the show into these tapes, all while additionally trying to present it as a fundamentally different thing for the sake of selling himself to another group of people. As Nick Briggs would sort of say later on, these things were made for everyone and thus appealed to no one. Doctor Who fans were buying tapes that just weren't what they were asking for and were filled with deception, and legitimate film producers looking for someone to direct real drama were surely just confused to see an opening card that reads, "These are terrorists from another dimension. They have completed their mission on Earth and now they want to leave. But they are trapped and they are desperate." But despite all of this, in an era of the Doctor Who fandom where Doctor Who just didn't exist, Baggs' projects were opened with welcome arms. I said that sentence wrong. But despite all of this, in an era of the fandom where it seemed like Doctor Who might never return, Baggs' projects were welcomed with open arms. They allegedly proved to be very profitable, although many of the actors who appeared in them noted that they never received ample compensation once the money started to flow in. Suddenly and mysteriously, Colin Baker never worked with Bill Baggs ever again. Further projects produced under the BBV label include the Auton trilogy and the Probe series. Both maintained very loose connections to the actual Doctor Who universe by licensing minor elements, respectively the Autons and Liz Shaw, a companion of the Third Doctor. As his notoriety grew, so did the amount of people willing to work with him. Perhaps one of the most interesting of these was the up-and-coming writer by the name of Mark Gatiss, who would write on numerous projects for Baggs and began working on many of the behind-the-scene features included on the company's tapes. It was clear that the BBV was on an incredible rise. But soon, a massive mistake would bring all of this to an end. The story goes that somewhere around 1998, Bill Baggs got in contact with the BBC and attempted to obtain a license to produce official Doctor Who audio dramas. They told him no. So he decided to do it anyways. And that is how we received Audio Adventures in Time and Space. There is a great difference to me between this and The Stranger, because this is a charming knockoff, and this is copyright infringement. So here's the basic rundown for how this series operates. In the actual show, Sylvester McCoy had played the Seventh Doctor, but he had a companion with a knack for calling him the nickname Professor. Thus, it was decided to credit the character as simply the Professor. Sophie Aldred had portrayed said companion, who had been named Ace in the show. In the audio series, her character would instead be named Ace.
Dr. Y and the lawsuit waiting to happen.
Just to clarify so we're all on the same page, in Doctor Who, Sylvester McCoy and Sophie Aldred played a pair of time travelers who went by the names Ace and Professor. And in this non-BBC produced audio series, Sylvester McCoy and Sophie Aldred played a pair of time travelers who go by the names Ace and Professor. Unlike The Stranger, which managed to skirt the law and carefully not use any copyrighted material, this series blatantly just used licenses that none of them owned, that they had asked for permission for and the BBC had said no, and they additionally used the original actors as if to imply that this might be licensed. These CDs are historical remnants of Baggs breaking the law under the belief that no one would ever care enough to get him in trouble. And for the first time ever, it seems that he was wrong. By the time that he was working on his second series of releases, Bill Baggs had received what I've come to understand to essentially be a cease and desist letter from the BBC, rightfully pointing out that his numerous Doctor Who clones were in direct conflict with their copyright. Baggs' response was to barely change the names of the main characters and continue producing that exact same series. He mystifyingly then immediately started producing yet another Doctor Who clone series, this time casting Nick Briggs in the role as to not attract suspicions. This saw Briggs fighting the mysterious Cyberrons, which are a clear knockoff of Cybermen, as a character without a name who is given the pseudonym Fred. The true final nail in the coffin for BBV came that same year when it was announced that the recently created Big Finish Productions had officially obtained the rights to produce Doctor Who audio dramas as the real deal. Soon enough, the company's output would prove to be very successful, leading to numerous releases every month, which only became more professional and satisfactory as time went on. In a world where so much real Doctor Who was suddenly existing, there just wasn't a lot of a market for almost Doctor Who. Many of Baggs' peers went on to collaborate with Big Finish for some time, but Baggs himself never had the chance. Apparently, the BBC insisted that they did not want someone who they had initiated a copyright dispute with to be involved in any official production. Baggs had essentially blacklisted himself from the entire franchise because he couldn't wait another year to make his vision for the show. But it seems like not too many people other than him were insanely upset by this prospect. By all accounts, Bill Baggs is a very controversial figure, even amongst people who he had at one point befriended. Based on the numerous accounts from people who knew him at this time, he was, at best, a charming and overzealous figure who could not keep his promises, and at worst, a borderline con artist. There are countless stories from around this time which all seem to show the same basic themes. Bill Baggs would lure people into his projects, having them work for almost nothing and promising them compensation later, and when that chance would come, he would then magically forget about those concerns. Knowing that the lack of consistent paperwork on his projects made it almost impossible to sue him over anything. The fact that he was allegedly a huge control freak and really hard to work with makes it pretty easy to understand why he was constantly burning bridges left and right. Since leaving the Doctor Who fandom, he is apparently into something called energy healing. So I'm leaning towards con artist. An extremely interesting detail of this era is how many people started off by working on these tapes and then ended up getting mainstream work outside of this. Nick Briggs would go on to focus most of his efforts at Big Finish, and would prove himself so capable in imitating classic Doctor Who baddies, that when the show was brought back in 2005, he became their main source for voicing monsters.
Exterminate! 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 Exterminate!
Mark Gatiss would become a massively successful writer and performer. He's arguably best known for being the co-creator of the BBC series Sherlock, alongside his longtime friend Stephen Moffat. He would star in and write for Doctor Who numerous times, most recently in the multi-Doctor thriller Twice Upon a Time, at the insistence of his friend. Honestly, just listing off the very lucrative work of Gatiss would probably justify its own standalone video. His success really is that widespread at this point. So the question is, did the massive success of these people happen because of, or in spite of, their connections to a company like BBV? Honestly, I think it's somewhere in the middle. I feel like working for BBV gave people like Nick Briggs and Mark Gatiss experience that they probably had a hard time finding outside of these cases. It allowed them to make stories and create videos when they really didn't have an outlet to do that otherwise. But at the same time, no one hired them because they had worked for BBV, so they basically still had to start from the bottom once they were done with this. What we've covered in this episode has been some of the most dumbfounding and deceptive examples of Who spin-off media from this era, but I don't want you guys leaving this video thinking this represents all of the output. A lot of stories, including Downtime and Wartime, are still respected today for being what they were. Great projects of passion created by fans who were entirely afraid that their universe, the one they loved so much, was going to just be abandoned. If anything, these tapes, these knockoffs, these bootlegs, they are evidence that even in a time of supposed failure, there was a huge market for Doctor Who stories. More than anything else, I think it's a shame that it took the BBC so long to figure this out for themselves. Oh, and you know Eddie Redmayne's character from Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Him? He's also a Doctor Who knockoff. Thanks for watching!